Joining me today on the Capital TV show, Jay Solomon. He's adjunct fellow, Washington Institute for Near Policy One-Up. Jay, you are most welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You are the author of an important book titled The Iran Wars. Tell us more about its major themes.
Well, the book basically tracked the conflict between the U.S. and Iran since 9/11, really. I mean, I get back a bit to the Shah and the history going back 40 years, but it really focused mostly on 9/11, the conflict between the U.S. and Iran since then, and what led up to the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement that was initially reached in 2015. Trump killed it, and now it's being resurrected. I think a key theme about it is just how central Iran has been as a spoiler, if you will, of U.S. ambitions, projects in the Middle East, whether it was their efforts to support militias in Iraq, support for the Taliban in Afghanistan, support for Hamas, Islamic Jihad in the Palestinian territories, and support for Hezbollah, and how certainly under the Obama administration, the hope was that if they could reach some sort of agreement with Iran, if they could reach some sort of détente, these conflicts could somehow be resolved, or they could find a modus operandi with the Iranians. Obviously, Trump took a very different track.
Yeah.
And said there is no détente to be reached with Iran. They only should be contained. And I think it's still a huge part in the debate on U.S. foreign policy, is whether you try to engage what's a revolutionary rogue regime, or you try to really contain it and hope that the more radical elements of the regime moderate themselves, or the regime is essentially removed by their own people at some point.
You mentioned Iran fueling terrorism in the region. Do you think that this administration should go back to massive sanctions, especially that sanctions have had a devastating impact on Iran's oil production?
I mean, that's really the crux of the debate over the JCPOA, the Iran deal. And the question is, can you silo one issue, which is the Iran nuclear deal, their nuclear program, and relieve sanctions, and sort of try to promote investment in some ways into Iran, while at the same time constrain their terrorism, constrain their support for their militias that have, basically turned Lebanon, Yemen, parts of Iraq into failed states, or helped to create failed states, even if they were in pretty bad shape to begin with. I think that really proved to be very difficult under the Obama administration. They kept saying, well, we'll lift some sanctions, but we'll keep others. And there are only, in my estimation, probably 2 or 3 sanctions that really matter. There are the sanctions on the oil, as you mentioned. There's the sanctions on the central bank of Iran, and then probably the sanctioning of some of the big, large private government banks. The other sanctions, I think the Iranians can live with, right? I mean, I don't think they care that much if the IRGC really is designated, as long as they can sanction the oil. I think it's difficult to constrain Iran if you reach an agreement to lift the oil sanctions, because that is the financial lifeline of that regime. And I think there's been a bit of a misunderstanding too. I don't think the supreme leader of Iran really wants massive foreign investment. His system, I think he believes, could be undermined by Western capital, Western companies. I think he wants enough money from oil to keep the regime going, but not so much foreign money, certainly from the West. Maybe he's okay with more money from China and Russia, but I think he sees Western capitalism, Western money, as a threat, and would like to constrain that.
You also wrote an important work called A Shadow War Between Israel and North Korea. Can you elaborate further on this premise?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the North Korean regime is, it's a radical revolutionary regime like Iran in some ways. It's just Iran is an Islamist regime. The North Korean model is more, they worship the Kim family and they're nominally communist or Marxist. But there has been a real convergence since probably the 60s between North Korea and many of the states, certainly in the Middle East, of which the US and Iran have been in conflict with. The North Koreans were probably the first in a lot of ways to provide arms to the Islamic Republic of Iran after the revolution, when the war with Iraq was going. The US had an arms embargo on Iran, and the North Koreans stepped up and started providing weapons to North Korea. To Iran. The North Koreans essentially built a nuclear reactor for the Syrians that the Israelis destroyed in 2008, but that was very much seen as essentially a bomb-making facility. It was going to produce plutonium to be used in nuclear weapons. And most of the missile systems in the Middle East, whether it was the Egyptians, the Iranians, the Syrians, came from North Korea in one shape or form. So
what about the Hezbollah's involvement in importing and exporting ammonium nitrate, the main chemical found to have caused the explosion of Beirut port?
I haven't focused that much, but yeah, ammonium nitrate can be used in all sorts of, munitions, all sorts of explosive devices. So, the idea that Hezbollah was basically warehousing some of this stuff in the port doesn't seem that crazy. And back to the North Koreans, I mean, there's been pretty strong evidence that the North Koreans have provided Assad with some of the chemical weapons that he's been using in the war against, his own civil war. But I think on the broader front, for the Israelis, the North Korean threat really became acute. And one of the more interesting things that I wrote about in that piece you cited was that in the 80s, they actually tried to essentially buy off the North Korean missile system. They said, look, you probably get, $500 million a year from exports. We'll give you some aid of $1 billion and we'll basically, the agreement that you will not sell this stuff to Iran or Syria. And it fell apart. But, the Israelis too have kind of gone between trying to buy off the North Koreans to actually, blowing up some of the facilities they created, like the reactor in northern Syria.
Are you aware of any developments going on now between Russia and Iran about the war in Ukraine?
Well, the U.S. government's been pretty outspoken about Iranian drones being transferred for use by the Russian military in Ukraine. The Iranians, I think, have denied it, but there have been photos in recent weeks, recent days, where you could see Farsi language on drones that were apparently shot down by the Ukrainian military. I mean, the Ukraine war has been interesting because I think there was some hope in the Biden administration that, Russia's invasion might clarify the global order, and countries like China and Russia might, stay out of the conflict, or at least diplomatically isolate Russia in some ways. In reality, it's been the complete opposite. The Russians have said they've been buying some arms from North Korea for use in Ukraine. I mentioned the drones that are apparently being used by the Russian military in Ukraine. And the Chinese, well, there hasn't been real, weapons transfers. They've been providing Russia with humanitarian food support and kind of diplomatic support in the UN and other cases. So, I think the Ukraine war has clarified that this block of nations, whether it's the Russians, the Chinese, the Syrians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, they really do work in consort in a lot of ways. And that's probably going to be more of a defining block going forward.
Talking about the Middle East, how do you evaluate the strategic choices the United Arab Emirates is doing at present?
I mean, it's interesting that one of the kind of big diplomatic endeavors of the Trump administration was the Abraham Accords, which was to promote diplomatic relations between Israel and certainly the Gulf states, but then it grew to include Morocco and Sudan. So, it seems like, I mean, they've been quite open about it. The UAE foreign minister has been in Israel this week, that they made a strategic decision that bringing Israel its technology, its investment, its security, its intelligence, its other military capabilities onto the side of the Arab states was in their strategic interest, and that's been a real change. There's been a real explosion of investment between the UAE and Israel, and it seems like it's been even better than both sides imagined. I think the question, in a lot of ways, and this is something in U.S. foreign policy that's been fought over for decades. Do you kind of hold the whole region hostage to the Arab-Israeli conflict, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or do you start moving? And this is what the Trump administration decided. Well, we'll hope the Israelis normalize with Arab states, and hopefully that will bring the Palestinians along, and that could help push the peace process forward. I don't think that has been clear which is the right solution so far, but it definitely, the UAE's decision and the following of Bahrain and Morocco and some of these other countries, it is redefining the region. And, the hope is it can breed a lot more investment, creativity, education, and, can push back against the Iranian nexus that is so powerful as well.
Exactly. We know that the United States and the United Arab Emirates are close friends and strong allies with shared interests and common values. They work together to promote regional security, create economic prosperity, and address pressing global challenges. Your thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat, that the U.S. has seen the UAE as an important ally. It's not just on the security front. The UAE has been pretty aggressive on looking, for clean energy, looking for all types of new technologies. So I don't think it's a particularly contentious issue. I think during the Trump administration, there was such close relations between the UAE and the Trump administration that some on the Democratic side were frustrated. But I think, if you look at the broader U.S. foreign policy, the UAE has been a pretty strong ally for a long time, and there's nothing to suggest that's going to change. And particularly, all these new technologies, pursuit of clean energy, these areas, the UAE has the funds to really kind of push investment in this area. And I know the U.S. sees that as incredibly valuable.
Jay Solomon, thank you so much for joining me on the Capital TV show.
Hey, Maria Malouf here. Please click to like and subscribe to Maria Malouf TV YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.